Hi everyone and welcome. Today I will be sharing my thoughts on 3 new fantasy releases that I read in the last couple of months and let you know whether or not I would recommend them. So basically a quick review for each of these. In this video I will be talking about The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan, Pandora by Susan Stokes-Chapman, and River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. And I will be talking about them in this order, so if you want to skip around in the video, of course you're more than welcome to do so. And that does mean that I will be starting with The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is the first book in a new fantasy series called The Empire of the Wolf, and often this is pitched as you will follow a justice called Sir Conrad. Now a justice in this world is basically the entire justice system. He roams the realm and sees whether or not the law is kept. If this is not the case, he will start an investigation. He will hold the trial, he will decide whether or not you are guilty, and if he does decide that you are guilty, he will also decide your punishment. So he does it all. Now, while I do think that this is a good explanation of some of the things that you will see in this story, because a big part of the story is actually a mystery and we see Sir Conrad doing his magic, I do think that it's very important to know that he is not our main POV. The story is told through the eyes of Helena, who is his clerk. And actually this is a narrative choice that I quite enjoy, where we have Helena, the older Helena, telling you her life story and her time while she was with Sir Conrad. Now this also adds a sense of tension and foreboding, because we know quite early in the story that this is going to be the tale of the fall of this empire. So we know that this series is not going to end quite well. And because of this, every time that something comes to a head, we are at the tip of our seat, because we know that the end result is going to be bad, so we don't know what is going to happen. When is this going to happen? When are we going to see some negative results? So I do think that this was a quite good choice by the author, and I really enjoyed that. Now, I do think that this also adds to the grimness of the book. Now, I wouldn't say that this is grimdark, but I do think that it has some things that lovers of grimdark will definitely appreciate, and I would put it on the same scale as something that we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, for instance. None of these main characters are very likable. I do think that we will like Helena, because even though she can be very annoying throughout the book, because this is told from the older Helena and she sometimes criticizes her younger self as well, we can kind of excuse her, and I do think that she can be likable in the future. However, the other characters are not. Sir Conrad tries to be just, but he's not a likable character, and the other characters that we have here are definitely flawed. Now, without getting into too much details, because I don't want to spoil anything, I also think that people who like to see people's downfall and who like to see people turn for the worst because of things that has happened to them, I think that those people will also like this book quite a bit. Now, in this book we do have a mystery, there is a murder, and like I said, we see Sir Conrad doing his magic, and he does have some magic. Now, this is a low magic world, most people don't have magic, but justices are trained to have certain attributes, and this is a soft magic system, but you do have some very interesting things that are happening, and I would leave you to discover them yourselves. But this is something that I quite enjoyed as well, and I do think that the mystery and how the mystery is resolved is quite nicely done. So this is more on a narrower scale in this first book. This mystery is resolved in the first book. And then of course we also have this big thing of the empire is going to fall. And this is of course a broader scope. What I liked here is also how religion comes into that story. And if you know me, you know that I love religion in stories. So this was very nicely done as well. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I think that people who like fantasy, not really grimdark, maybe if grimdark is too dark for you, but you do like more realistic characters and some grim things in your tales, I think that you will enjoy this one as well. Now, often people compare this to The Witcher, and I don't really agree with that. I think that a lot of people think that because you have Helena and Sir Conrad's relationship here, and then in The Witcher you have Ciri and Geralt, I also think that the two empires that we have in these two worlds maybe are quite similar. But other than that, I think that the writing style is completely different. In The Witcher we have a multiple POV story. Here we have one POV, which is narrated by the older self, which we don't really see in The Witcher. I also think that the relationships in The Witcher are more wholesome than what we have here. And in The Witcher we have quite a bit of humor, which is also not present here. Now, that doesn't mean that you will like this one if you like The Witcher, because I really enjoyed both. But don't go into this expecting The Witcher. And maybe if you didn't like The Witcher, don't expect that you will not like this one, because for me at least they are very different from one another. Next up, I want to talk about Pandora by Susan Stokes-Chapman. This is a fantasy standalone, and it's often pitched as a Greek myth retelling. Now, I'm going to say this straight away, it's not a Greek myth retelling, it's a story, and I would say for the most part it's actually historical fantasy with some magic dashed in, but it's really minimal, where we have mention of the myth of Pandora. In this book we follow Dora. This actually takes place at the end of the 18th century, 1799 to be exact, and Dora is the daughter of two antique shop owners. Unfortunately, they died when Pandora was quite small, and now the shop is the responsibility of her uncle and also of course her care. Now her uncle is a pretty sketchy person. He does some very strange things with the shop. He's quite horrible towards Dora as well, so of course their relationship is strained. Now, one day her uncle brings in a very beautiful antique Greek vase and he stores it in the basement. He doesn't talk about it, so of course Dora is quite intrigued. Now, the other POV that we follow is that of Edward. Edward wants to become an antique shop owner and he wants to do excavations, but in order to be allowed to do that, he needs to write a thesis about a historical object. And of course, these two storylines come together. Now, I actually quite enjoyed this one for what it is. I do think that you need to know going in that it's not a Greek myth retelling, because if you do expect that, if you do expect a lot of interference of the gods and stuff like that, you're not going to get that here. I think that for 95% of the story, maybe even more, there is no magic and there is no myth. Of course, you have the mystery of the vase that is here, and you can probably imagine that that has something to do with this Pandora myth. But other than that, it's more the story about Dora, her uncle, and of course Edward, and I don't think that I need to explain that there might be a little bit of a romance. Now, I quite enjoyed this. You also have an animal companion that you can see right here. It's a beautiful little bird, and I really liked that addition to the story. The small bits of magic that were here, I actually didn't like, because I felt like it didn't really fit the story. We have different plot lines, of course, in this book, and one of the plot lines is resolved in a magical kind of way, and that's actually my least favorite part of this story, because I just thought that it didn't fit and it was almost shoehorned in there to make it more Greek myth-esque. Now, because it was only 1% of the story, that little plot line, I didn't really mind too much, but I wished that the author hadn't done that. However, if you do want to have just a fantasy standalone that's very historical fiction-esque and very closely related to that in a setting and in a time period that we don't often see in fantasy, I would highly recommend this. Also, in terms of the writing style, this one reminded me of Alex E. Harrow's The Once and Future Witches, and especially the writing style, because I actually didn't like that book and I did like this one, but I loved Alex E. Harrow's writing style. And I think if you liked that one, you will also really enjoy this one. And for me, the characters here were better than in that one. So yes, I also recommend this one. Just know what you're getting into. And then another book that I want to discuss, and that is of course River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. Now, this was pitched to me as a fantasy standalone. However, by now I have realized that that's not the case. This is the first one in a fantasy duology called The Elements of Cadence. And the final book is coming out later this year. So if you are somebody who likes to binge a series, you will be able to do that for this one pretty soon. But in any case, I do think that this one reads as a standalone. The main plot lines for the first book are resolved in this book, but then you have some open threads, and because of that you know what the main plot of the second book is going to be. And I think that that will be a very enjoyable story as well. I think that this book will be perfect for people who like folklore retellings. Even though this does take place in a secondary world, we do have some things that remind us of our own world, like a laird, for example, and it just feels like a folklore retelling. It reminds me a little bit of the Queens of Innisleer in the sense of how magic is being used here, because magic is nature-based, and I quite enjoyed it as well. I think of the three that we have here, this is the one that feels most magical. Now, in this book we meet Jack. Jack is a bard and he lives on the mainland where there is no magic. He went there because he wanted to study music. However, one day he received a message from his laird to come back to the island where nature-based magic is present, because something is happening and they need his help. Now, this bard knows that there are two clans on the island, so he thinks that maybe something is happening in that regard. But when he arrives on the island, he discovers that girls are getting missing and they don't know what's happened to them, they don't know who has them, and maybe it's something to do with the spirits of the island, and maybe they are not really happy at this point. Now, this bard, Jack, doesn't really know what he can do to help, but of course he quickly discovers what exactly he can do. In this book we have two romances, but I think if you don't like romance, you might still enjoy this book, because of course we still have this mystery of the girls, we still have this nature-based magic, we have a very rich world. But if you really hate romance, if you don't want to see anything of that, it is a quite significant portion of the story. Now, like I said, we have two romances. The first one is quite innocent between two young people, but the one that I found most interesting was actually between two older people who have already been married, but one day one of their girls gets missing. And of course, this begs the question, what will happen to us? What if this girl will never return? What if our daughter never returns home? Do we still have a marriage here? Or will this have an effect on our marriage that is just not resolvable? I really enjoyed that as well. I think that the mystery of what happens to the girls gets resolved here quite nicely, and like I said, I am really dying to get the second book because I really enjoyed this one. Now, the characters are not really memorable, in my opinion. I liked them while I was reading about them. This is a multi-POV story, by the way, but now that I've put the book down, I can't really tell you a lot about all of them. Like I said, the older couple I really enjoyed. The two younger people, they were interesting enough, but they are quite forgettable. However, I don't really mind that much. I think that this was just a very magical story. It does lean more into the historical fiction feel of fantasy than more the fairy tale-esque feel, but all in all, I really enjoyed this one. And if any of this sounds interesting to you, especially the mystery, I think that you will definitely enjoy this one as well. Now, are you going to read any of these, or have you read any of them and do you want to share your thoughts? Definitely do so in the comments down below. If you haven't seen my last video where I talk about 3 new fantasy releases, you can watch that one right here. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video and see you next time. Bye!